Um, okay. Okay, so we are going to start this session. The session is on economic history and economics of culture. We have four very exciting presentations. First by Dafeng Su, and then Caroline Fry, Ricardo Turati, and Martin Fernandez Sanchez. As for the plenary session that ended 20 minutes ago, the allocation of time is about the same. So you have 18 to 20 minutes for presentation, then something like 8-10 minutes for the discussant, and whatever remains for questions from the other participants. So if you want to ask questions, please send me private chat messages and to me and to Michael, who is the host of this session. And we will try to convey the information that there will be questions at the end. I think it's best to have them not at the end of the session, but at the end of each presentation. Okay, so without waiting more, Dafeng, I pass it on to you for your paper, Separate from the Separated City, Transportation, Geography, and Political Economy behind Slavic Emigration from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Please don't repeat the title, that will save 1 minute. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So could you hear me and could you see the slides?
I do hear you and do see the slides, yes.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. So this paper focuses on an historical event of the opening of a new sea route from the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and a study its effect on emigration of ethnic minorities. This paper is motivated by a variety of observations that the political economy often plays a key role in driving minority migration. And in the early 20th century, many immigrants from Europe were indeed the ethnic minorities in their home country, and they were driven by political oppression and economic discrimination, including immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So at the time, Austro-Hungary was one empire, but they had two nearly independent governments. So, and this paper focused specifically on Hungary and its two Slavic minority groups, namely the Yugoslavs and Slovaks. So Yugoslavs were literally the southern Slovaks. They lived in the southern part of the Hungary, today's Croatia. And Slovaks lived in Slovakia, which was the northern part of Hungary at the time. So similarly, they faced similar political and economic disadvantage under the nationalism and populism in Hungary. And they both had the incentives in terms of politics and economics to migrate, and the US was the main destination at the time. So the only difference was that they lived in different geographic areas. And when talking about migration, another whole different line of literature focuses on the development of steamship technology that made transatlantic migration faster and safer during the entire 19th century. But it was not only about technology, actually it was also about development commerce. For example, there were many newly opened passenger sea routes, mainly in Northwestern Europe, like Hamburg, like British ports. And there was also increasingly many services and agencies for passenger shipping and migration. But let's explore about the development of railway networks in continental Europe that might be related to international migration as well. So this was not surprising, because when you look at the major sending countries of immigrants at the time, you could see like England, Italy, and Germany, and the Scandinavian countries, which were all on the seashore, so they had a lot of seaports. But if you think about Central European immigrants, they first need to travel from their hometown to Vienna or to Budapest, and then traveled through Germany and then moved to the United States eventually. So this means that when we consider migration from Central Europe to the United States, maybe it was about not only transporting resources for the Atlantic Ocean, but also within the continents of their origin. So the broad question of this paper focuses on the new sea route that might divergent migration patterns due to constraint of transportation resources, both internationally and domestically. And I study how transportation geography shapes emigration patterns of ethnic minorities who are politically and economically disadvantaged, focusing on the case study of the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And specifically, this paper lies in the background that Hungary opened its first and only transatlantic passenger sea route between the so-called separate body city Fiume, which is today Rijeka in Croatia, and New York in 1904. So this new seaport was located in the Yugoslav region. So you can imagine that many Yugoslavs resided near this port. But for Slovaks, they mainly resided in today's Slovakia, which was the northern part of the country, and the distance from Slovakia to this new seaport could be easily over 1,000 kilometers. And today it was not really a big issue, but at that time, because of Hungary's poor railway connections, later I will show some number, that even if this new sea route might lead to motivation for migration, but the transition from motivation to actual migration behaviors might be affected by these poor railway connections. And in this paper, I study whether the opening of this new sea route led to divergent migration patterns in terms of both the magnitude of emigration and selection on migration based on socioeconomic status. So this is the preview of the results. I find that the new sea route led to divergent emigration patterns between Yugoslavs and Slovak from Hungary. And in particular, there was an increase in Yugoslav migration relative to other ethnic groups, and there was a decrease in Slovak migration. And also, I find evidence of negative selection on Yugoslav migration and positive selection on Slovak migration to the United States relative to other groups. So I would like to spend a few minutes talking about the historical background of this paper, that after 1877 and after the Austro-Prussian War, Hungary became one of the two rulers of the empire, and there were a couple of minority groups in Hungary. And there was a high degree of political and economic inequality in Hungary. And if you look at the areas around Budapest, the capital of Hungary, they were doing okay, but outside the central part of Hungary, there were actually strong economic disadvantages. And moreover, because of their cultural assimilation policies, many minorities felt that they were politically oppressed as well. And two typical examples were the Slavic minorities, which were Yugoslavs and Slovakias, Slovaks who lived in different parts of the country, but they both felt political and economic inequality, and they had incentive to emigrate to other countries. And historical documents again showed that the US was their main destination. So this is a map of the entire empire and the Hungarian part. And you can see that this is the port, the new port. The port was not new, but the sea route was new and for the passenger shipping. So you can see that many Yugoslavs lived nearby the town, but for Slovaks, Slovakia was far away from the port. So the distance to the seaport might be the major obstacle to migration. And we have quite a few British diplomatic reports that documented the transportation information in Hungary. And in particular, they show that after the opening of this new sea route for passengers, more than 80% of the migrants were through this new sea route from Fiume to New York. And the frequency of the sea route was not really high, like it shipped every 2 weeks. The ticket was actually cheaper than the British-US sea route. It took longer time, but it was okay. The problem is that when you look at the railway system in Hungary, and it was not very good, and the two rulers of the empire had separate systems for railway connections, and for Hungary, you can see that there was there was a shortage of the state line railways, and most railways in Hungary are actually concentrated around Budapest. So it would be costly in both time and money for railway traveling from other parts of Hungary to the port. So here are some numbers. I don't think I have time to talk about that in detail, but the conclusion is that if you include transfers, accommodation, etc., traveling within Hungary, for example, from Slovakia to the seaport, could be comparable to transatlantic migration for Slovaks. But in contrast, this was not really a big problem for Yugoslavs, particularly who lived nearby the town. So this might lead to the divergent effects of the new sea route on the migration patterns between the two Slavic groups. So to study this empirical question, I use the US Census data of immigrants who reported the country of birth as either Hungary or any divisions of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And unfortunately, in the US Census, at the time, there was a very confusing coding system of birth. So people have different answers. So the good thing is that I can construct two samples to test the results separately, and the results are quite similar as I change the sample. Use the ethnic specific language to identify ethnicity among immigrants. So this is the main sample for analysis, but the census sample only records the migration stock rather than migration flows. So this might not be a big problem for this paper because of a fairly low return migration rate among Hungarian citizens, and possibly due to the fear of economic and political inequality back in their home country. And also, as an additional test, I used the passenger list data that recorded the flows rather than migration stock. But there are a couple of issues with the list data as well, so I didn't use it as the main empirical analysis, but still it is an additional test. So as for the empirical strategy, in this paper, I estimate the effect of this new sea route on emigration of Yugoslavs and Slovaks separately in terms of both the magnitudes of emigration and selection on emigration. So for the magnitudes of emigration, I focus on the trends in share of ethnicity in the immigrant population from Hungary or from Austro-Hungary by cohort. And for selection on emigration, I compare the earnings and urban residence of an ethnic group of interest with other ethnic groups from Hungary or from Austro-Hungary. So the essential idea of testing the trends in magnitudes of emigration and its relationship with the new sea route is to compare trends in the magnitudes of emigration by cohort before and after 1904, reflected by the share of ethnicity among the immigrant population. So basically, this is a first difference and a regression within an event study framework, but of course, it might capture a general migration trend. So usually people want to construct different data by including a control group. So one natural candidate of the control group is Polish minorities in the Austria proper, because they similarly faced political and economic disadvantages, but they were not related to the new sea route because they were far away. They lived in today's Western Ukraine, so not really relevant for traveling through Fiume port. And also I consider another control group constructed by the Slavic minorities in Imperial Russia. And for selection on emigration, I similarly compare trends in socioeconomic outcomes by cohort for Yugoslavs and Slovaks separately, before and after 1904. So, and also I considered including the control group to run a triple difference specifications by comparing the Yugoslavs and or Slovak earnings and urban residents with other ethnic groups and with other ethnic groups from outside of Hungary. So these are the empirical strategies, and using the methods, this is the result from the migration stock data from the US Census samples. And again, I focused on two samples. In one sample, everyone reported Hungary as their birthplace, and in another sample include all immigrants who reported an Austro-Hungarian divisions. But in both samples, I find that there was a sharp increase in the share of Yugoslav ethnicity after the 1904 cohort, and there was a relatively stable pre-trend. And if you look at the share of Slovaks, there was a sharp decline in the Slovak ethnicity after 1904. So you can see that, and in terms of magnitude of emigration, 1904 means the discontinuity, and the migration pattern was divergent. And I used the passenger list data to see the effects on migration flows, and it seems that I find a similar results. And I run different diff using different types of control groups, and similarly, I find the divergent patterns in terms of magnitudes of immigration among Yugoslavs and Slovaks relative to other ethnic groups. And also, I find no placebo effects when I move the opening of the new seaports a couple of years earlier than the actual year. And furthermore, I also find some evidence of selection on emigration in terms of earning and urban residents. So this is the result for occupation-based earnings of Yugoslavs and Slovaks. And among the cohorts, there was a decline in occupation-based earnings for Yugoslavs, and there was an increase in earnings among Slovaks. Similarly true for urban residents. There were fewer Yugoslavs living in the cities, which usually reflected high socioeconomic status in the United States at that time, and also today, actually. And for Slovaks, it is the opposite, that the proportion of urban residents actually increased after 1904 for the cohorts in the United States. So I'll also run the triple difference by including the control group living outside of Hungary, and I find the same results, that 1904 marked the year of divergent patterns of selection on emigration for Yugoslavs and Slovaks. So to conclude this paper, many historical reports show that ethnic inequality drove Slavic emigration to the United States from Hungary in the early 20th century. And the opening of the new transatlantic sea route definitely led to mass emigration. But this paper shows that it actually led to divergent patterns of emigration between the two groups, and among which there were substantial differences in the distance to the seaport. And it might be related to Hungary's poor railway connections that made the distance to the seaport possibly a major obstacle to emigration. And indeed, in empirical analysis, I use a couple of strategies and data to show that after the opening of the new sea route, there was a relative increase in Yugoslav migration relative to other ethnic groups from Hungary, and there was a relative decrease in Slovak migration. And also, I found evidence of negative selection on Yugoslav migration and a positive selection on Slovak migration to the United States, measured by earnings and their residential patterns. So one important implication of this paper is that we often talk about physical mobility of international migration that was related to transportation between the host and home country. But this paper actually points out a point that the first step of international migration is actually sometimes internal migration that might be an obstacle to international migrants as well. And particularly in this paper, I find that migration effects of political and economic inequality was complicated by the spatial heterogeneity in not only international, but also domestic transportation development within their home country. And also, we often talk about the opening of a new seaport or new transportation and infrastructure that is a common economic development policy for the sake of trade, human capital flow, etc. But in this paper, actually, opening the new seaport led to mass of Yugoslavs and a positive selection of Slovak migration. And this seems to be not really a good outcome. So, but I would say that the new sea route was not a fundamental reason for these outcomes, but it was a channel through which the migration effects of inequality were generated. So this is the last sentence of this presentation. So the economic development policies under a high degree of ethnic inequality might lead to unintended and sometimes negative consequences. While this paper does not really show the surprising or counterintuitive effects, counterintuitive results,
Dafenga, I have to
also
stop you.
yeah. Okay. So the last few words, it was quite unintended and unexpected. So, but sorry that I have to stop here. But thank you very much. And this is indeed the last slide. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So we move to Toman Barsby from Bristol for the discussion, and then maybe we have a few more questions toward the end of the discussion.
Thanks.
All right. Can you see and hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Each of you, so I wish we could meet in person and like do this in a normal way, but it's still nice to see you. And yeah, I really enjoyed reading this paper. I didn't know much about this region and this episode of European history. So before I give you my comments, let me just give you like a really brief summary, graphical summary of this paper. So basically, this paper looks at a very interesting context of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which already started to kind of dissolve during that time. And what you can see here is a map of the different ethnicities defined here by mother tongue. And basically, Dafeng zooms in and has a specific look at two different ethnicities. So the Slovaks, on the one hand, they're up here in the north of Hungary, or Hungary proper, as it was called back then. And he also zooms in on the Yugoslavs, so consisting of Croats and Serbs mostly. So what happened was that in 1904, a new sea road opened, so you could basically migrate out of Hungary using that port of Fiume and have a direct connection to New York. So the paper argues that this basically allowed migrants from Hungary to migrate to the US more easily. But most importantly, given that this port was very close to the kind of ethnic homeland of the Yugoslavs, they had lower migration costs because the Slovaks would also need to cover their migration costs and transportation costs internally to make it to the port of Fiume. And consistent with this, basically Dafeng shows that once the sea route opened in 1904, the share of Yugoslav immigrants arriving in the United States among all immigrants arriving from Hungary proper increased, and consistent with the idea that those coming from Slovakia faced higher migration costs, this share decreased over time. So there's a lot to like at this paper. I think this is a really fascinating context, and I think that economists, at least so far, have paid surprisingly little attention to this pretty diverse region of Europe. So there are lots of different ethnicities in a fairly small geographic region. And in addition, I think we still know relatively little about the migration patterns of ethnic minorities. So when you think about migration of ethnic minorities, it's typically the case that I guess they face additional push factors because they also are confronted with economic discrimination and potentially political oppression. And I think it's also quite plausible that migration costs were relatively more reduced for Yugoslavs once the sea route has opened. So one main comment I have, so ideally to make the argument that it's really these kind of domestic migration costs that explain these differential immigration rates, you would want to have two minorities that are similar in all dimensions except the one when it comes to the distance to the port. So to be honest, I'm not quite convinced that this is really the case. So first of all, I think there is a sizable difference in the size of these different minorities. So I checked the census of 1910, which also distinguishes between different mother tongues. And you can see that Slovak is the mother tongue of about 10.7% of the population of Hungary proper, whereas Serb or Croat is the mother tongue of substantially smaller population share. So if you think that minorities' degree of suppression depends on the relative size, I would basically expect that the degree of suppression for the Yugoslavs would be larger, meaning that the potential benefits of migration for that particular minority might be higher. In addition, like when it comes to the composition of these different minorities, I also think there are some differences that should be acknowledged. So here, Austro in 1880. So basically, the darker or better an area, the higher the literacy rate in that area. You can see that up here, literacy rates are close to 50%, 60%. But down here where the Yugoslavs live, it's more close to 10%, 20%, or 30%. So there are some differences in terms of skill composition between these two minorities. And I think importantly, the Slovaks are also pretty close to another potential destination for internal or kind of like at least intra-European migration. That's Vienna. So Vienna during this time was a really booming city and kind of like cosmopolitan, attracted people from all over the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which you can see here, like in the 19th century, lots of migrants arrived in Vienna and made this one of the largest cities in Europe. So I just wonder to what extent potentially different destination choices could be made in the region in which the Slovaks were based as compared to the region where the Yugoslavs were based. So given this, I just wonder, like, to what extent these differences potentially confound the migration decision. So is it really the case that the geographic distance to the port and kind of internal migration costs explain this differential migration, which you kind of stress in your conclusion, or could it potentially also be the case that the benefits of migration, so abstracting from migration costs, differ for these two different minorities? I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it would be nice to explore this possibility a bit more. Do you have more time, Hillel, or do I need to stop?
No, I think if you're done, it's good. We may leave 2 minutes to the Feng to answer, and then move to the next paper.
Then I stop here. Thanks.
So yeah, thank you very much for your comments. That is really helpful, and I do think about some of the answers to your question, but it is probably longer than 2 minutes. So probably I will leave after this presentation, this conference, and maybe I can send you the email to talk about that in detail. So, but thank you very much for your comment, and thank you very much, Hillel. And it was really nice to present here. But because of the time constraint, maybe we should move on.
Okay, I agree with that. And thank you both for keeping on time. And so we can move to the second presenter, Caroline Fry. You were at MIT at the time the paper was submitted, and you're moving to a more sunny destination in Hawaii. So I don't know if that has changed your view in this paper or not, but I'll leave it to you to
online. Thank you. Great. Thanks so much. So I'm really happy to present my work on the return migration of African scientists. So everybody can hear me?
Yep.
Good. Okay, so in the late 1980s, Charles Maponga, here, originally from Zimbabwe, traveled to the United States to study for his Doctor of Pharmacy at the University of Buffalo. It was there that he met Professor Jean Morse, who was a young scholar who shared his interest in stopping the HIV epidemic. Following his studies, Charles returned home and took up a position at the University of Zimbabwe, but he remained in contact with Jean, and it was through Jean that Charles and his new colleagues at the University of Zimbabwe became involved in the AIDS clinical trials group And it was together with this global network of HIV researchers that the scientists at the University of Zimbabwe became involved in some of the highest impact HIV clinical trials around the world, including a series of trials that provided the evidence for treatment as prevention, which was instrumental in stopping the spread of AIDS. So while this case suggests that the scientists at the University of Zimbabwe leveraged the return home of Charles and his relationship with Jean to develop their scientific capacity and participate in high impact research, whether this is a causal relationship is an empirical question. And so in this study, I ask, can scientists returning home to Africa following training in the United States build bridges between non-migrants in the institutions they return to and American-based scientists? And what are the impact of these bridges, if any, on innovative performance? I also explore which kinds of non-migrants benefit the most from these return events and how they might benefit from association with a returnee. Okay, so why am I asking this question? Well, although it's very well established that the production of brand new to world knowledge is important for economic growth, health, and other outcomes, the production of this new knowledge is dominated by a handful of individuals, firms, and countries. So as you can see from this map of publication production, there are particularly low levels of innovative activity in sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, despite over 1 billion people living in sub-Saharan African countries, excluding South Africa, not one person born or living in these countries has ever been awarded a Nobel Prize in Science. So we have a good understanding that knowledge doesn't travel very well over geographic distance and particularly over national borders. And so for those scientists located far away from the dominant producers of knowledge, it can be a challenge to access that latest knowledge, which is a crucial input into subsequent knowledge generation. And compounding these difficulties associated with geographic distance from dominant producers and users of knowledge, I argue that there's a global status ordering of scientists. So why is this important? We'll take as an example these early academies of science depicted here, which reserved just 40 chairs for an elite group of scientists. And the members of this exclusive invisible college benefited from superior access to knowledge and resources and recognition as a consequence of their status. And unfortunately, not much has changed today because of some of those features of the Republic of Science, including a winner-takes-all reward system and uncertainty associated with some less distinguished actors. For those outside of these exclusive circles, it can be a challenge to access crucial inputs to do good science. So Merton accurately described the Republic of Science in the 60s when he said the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And with African scientists by many measures less elite than their global peers, this could present additional difficulties in improving their scientific performance. So one solution to these problems that I outlined is to develop ties with insiders or high-income country scientists who can, in theory, share their access to knowledge and resources with their affiliates. And an increasingly popular way to develop these ties is to study abroad. So governments and donors are increasingly encouraging low-income country nationals to study abroad in high-income countries, with the hope that they return home following their studies and bring their knowledge and connections with them. And there are some really promising anecdotes on the impact of returnees in some sectors. So Annalise Saxenian describes in her book, she's talking about returning Taiwanese entrepreneurs after they spend time in Silicon Valley. And she says that these highly skilled immigrants are now increasingly transforming the brain drain into brain circulation by returning home to start new companies whilst maintaining their social and professional ties to the US. But unfortunately, the recent evidence on the return home of scientists actually suggests much more disappointing results from these returnees. So 2 recent studies trace the movement home of scientists trained in high-income countries to low-income countries and finds that on return home, they experience a decline in productivity as compared to scientists who remain in higher-income countries. In addition, recent evidence from another study of mine from the 2014 West African Ebola outbreak suggests that the formation of ties, which was a shock that occurred to West African scientists during that outbreak, can actually increase inequality amongst low-income country scientists. And so together, this provides a motivation to look beyond that individual trained abroad or developing this tie to high-income countries. And I evaluate the spillover impact of the return home of these American-trained scientists on non-migrants in the institutions they return to. So in thinking about how a returning scientist might impact non-migrants, I'm considering the role of the broader institutional environment and network that these scientists are embedded in. And specifically, global science exhibits a core periphery network structure. And by that we mean, and as the figure on the left shows, central actors, in this case, US institutions in my sample, are densely connected and benefit from superior access to knowledge and connections, whilst in the same network, in this case, at the African institutions in my sample, more peripheral actors are more loosely connected and suffer from issues of legitimacy when struggle to gain access to necessary resources to do good science. So returning scientists moving from core to periphery and taking their central connections with them can act as a broker between these two environments. And I argue that these returning scientists can provide what I call this core periphery bridge between that core where the central resources of knowledge exist and these peripheral institutions. And the mechanism by which they do this is providing the non-migrants with legitimacy by sponsoring them and basically providing introductions to the core. And so I argue that these non-migrants can then access these returning scientists' knowledge and connections, and that this is most likely to be most useful for non-migrants who are more peripheral or more isolated, who struggle with these legitimacy issues. So in order to test these hypotheses, the empirical setting for this project is the NIH Poverty International Center AIDS International Research Training Program. And so this program provides US principal investigators with grants to host low-income country scientists in master's, PhD, and postdoc programs, and then incentivizes them to return home following their studies using a variety of carrot and stick initiatives. And so I evaluate the impact of the return home of African trainees as part of this program between 1988 and 2014. So that's the beginning of the program. The program's still going on, but I just wanted a post period, so I stopped in 2014. And I look at the impact of the return home of these trainees on non-migrants affiliated with the institutions they return to. So the data for the project comes from a few different places. So the sample of returning scientists and the associated data on these returnees comes directly from the US institutions involved. So I called up the US institutions and asked for the names of their trainees. And then I asked for other details of what program they were involved, what year they graduated, and I have details on the PI in the program as well. I then matched these scientists with their publication record using the Elsevier Scopus database. And where possible, I found them on LinkedIn or in a Google search to find out their exact role on their return and confirm the institution that they went back to. And so I get the data, the non-migrants, from a full census of African scientists that I have, that I generated, again, using Elsevier Scopus publication database and the affiliations in publication records. And I basically extract those scientists who are affiliated with these institutions that the returnees go back to in the year that they're returning. Then I match each scientist in the sample with their full publication history, and I complement this quantitative data with qualitative data that are gathered during interviews and site visits to many of these treated and control institutions as well, which I'll go into. So the evaluation is of the impact of the first return home of an American trained scientist in a non-migrant's career, although expanding that to see if subsequent returns have a greater impact. And so this main evaluation gives me 112 returning scientists in the time period analyzed. So they go back to a variety of countries across sub-Saharan Africa, excludes South Africa because it's quite a different level of development from the other countries in the sample. And they go back to universities, research institutes, and government ministries. And anecdotally, and from their LinkedIn records, I find that they go back to pretty senior positions in these institutions, having graduated from a very prestigious program. So I measure the causal impact of the return home on non-migrants affiliated with the institutions they return to through exploiting the graduation date of the returning trainee, which is arguably exogenous to these non-migrants. And I employ a difference in differences method, comparing the change in publication outcomes of non-migrants affiliated with an institution receiving a returning trainee before and after the return to that of matched control scientists affiliated with an institution not receiving a returning scientist in the same time period. In the empirical framework, I employ individual level fixed effects to account for any scientist level heterogeneity, and I have other models accounting for institution level heterogeneity as well. So I generate this matched control sample through using the same census of African scientists with the gathered through their affiliations in publication records, and I extract observably similar scientists affiliated with these institutions not receiving a returning scientist. And I use a cause and exact matching procedure to ensure that treated and control scientists are matched on individual, and also I now have individual plus institution level characteristics. And so for each treated scientist, I find their best match, so one other scientist, who is given their counterfactual treatment year, and a returning scientist US training institution, which becomes relevant in some of the outcomes that I use later on. Okay, so what do I find? So I find that following return home of an American trained scientist, non-migrants affiliated with the institution they return to experience a 6% annual increase in publication output. And this is robust to quality adjustments as well of these publications. And this is mostly in publications without that returning scientist. So I'll go into later if I have time. I rule out the possibility that the mechanism driving this observed productivity change is just teamwork with this returning scientist. I also find that non-migrants tend to shift their research direction, and they tend to publish, they're more likely to publish in HIV research following the return home of that American trained scientist. Okay, so perhaps more interestingly, how do these non-migrants benefit, and what's driving this productivity change following these return events? So I find evidence that these returnees are able to share their knowledge with these non-migrants in the institutions they return to. And in particular, I find that the non-migrants cite both the US, but specifically the US training institution of that returning scientist more following the return event as compared to match control scientists. And they're 33% more likely to cite the training institutions. This is economically significant change in knowledge flows. I also find that non-migrants are able to borrow or share those connections that the returning scientists have. And similarly, they're able to collaborate with both the US, but specifically the US training institution of the returning scientists more than these match controls are after the return event. Okay, so in exploring which kinds of scientists are most affected by these return events, I split my sample of treated and control scientists into 3 different groups. Those that are connected to this training institution before the return event, those that are connected to OECD scientists in general before the return event, and the third group in columns 3 and 6 are those who aren't well connected to any central core OECD institutions. And I find, consistent with my theoretical predictions, that the sample driving this main effect is those who aren't well connected already and struggle with these legitimacy issues. And I explore the mechanisms of action in my qualitative data, and I just present one quote that sort of gives a summary of how this is working. So one returning trainee says to me, "I was a big go-between. If people at my institution specialize in different ways from me, and people from the United States reach out to me, I introduce them." So idea that this returnee is providing this matchmaking service to these non-migrants, but also to US scientists. Okay, so I just rule out very quickly a couple of alternative explanations that we might think could be driving the results. So as I said, we might be concerned, or we might imagine that the non-migrants are benefiting because of teamwork with the returnee, or from direct knowledge flows from the returning scientists. You get a superstar in your institution, so you benefit from that. So to rule out the teamwork, I split the sample of treated and control scientists again into those who are more likely or less likely to co-author with that returning scientist based on pre-return characteristics, and find that those who are less likely are driving that observed effect again. And I also find absolutely no evidence that the non-migrants are citing the returning scientists' publications any more than match control scientists, which was somewhat of a surprise because we have evidence that when people move around within rich countries, you would expect to see the citation bump to the movers' publications. But clearly something else is going on in these low-income countries, or these high to low-income country movements. Okay, so just a brief summary of what I find. So I find that following the return home of an American trained scientist, non-migrants affiliated with the institution they returned to experience an increase in productivity, and mostly in the related subject of the returnee, so in HIV research in this case. And I find strong evidence of the mechanism driving this productivity change is the returnee forming what I call this core periphery bridge between American and African institutions. So this leads to a couple of implications. First of all, there are broad spillover benefits, obviously, to training low-income country scientists, but also that this prior network access mitigates the success of the bridge building. And I was thinking through some potential policy implications. I think this implies that rather than clumping returnees together in institutions, which we might think might give them an extra boost, perhaps it's a good idea to spread out returnees amongst institutions for the broadest spillover impact. Okay, so just a quick return on investment on these return events. So I find that one returnee tends to produce 5 publications on average in the 5-year period following their return event, and they produce 4 spillover publications. So that's 80% of their direct impact. And so very crude back of the envelope cost calculation. So an average cost per returnee is $144,000. I got this data from the US institutions. I just asked them how much does one of these trainees cost. And so just dividing 144,000 by this number of publications that we get per African institution from these trainees, I find that the cost is $16,000 per publication in an African institution. And estimates of cost per publication in the US range from $350,000 to $1.7 million. So, you know, this is a little trite. I think this is comparing apples to oranges a little bit because I'm not looking at the direct costs and the reallocation of research funding. But from the African institutions perspective, this seems like an incredibly effective way to participate in this global science and high impact research. And more broadly, you know, we really care about health impacts of these returning scientists rather than sort of number of publications. And so anecdotally, many, as I mentioned in the introduction, many of these scientists, both non-migrants and returnees, are participating in high impact HIV clinical trials, and you can find numerous examples of these returnees and their institutions really contributing to our knowledge of HIV and the stopping the spread of it. Okay, so it's just some final thoughts. So over the last 50 years, there's been a significant rise in the level of capacity building efforts in developing countries for science and innovation. And typically, many program evaluations have measured the impact of programs on publication outcomes of the trained individuals, with sometimes really disappointing results. There's been much less focus, to my knowledge, on mechanisms driving any improvements and individuals beyond the program. And so this suggests perhaps we've been looking in the wrong place and looking at slightly the wrong mechanism for the impact of these programs and the ROI on the programs. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Caroline. And your discussion is Pierre-Louis Vézina from King's College. And so if you can do it in 8 minutes, so we have time for Caroline to reply and also maybe for some questions from other participants. Thank you.
Full screen.
Right now we see, yeah.
I'll keep it like this. Can you hear me?
Okay, you should put your hand below the table.
Okay, so can you hear?
Yes, we can hear you, yeah. Go
on. Thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. So it's a great paper. It has a main convincing result, which is that African scientists trained in the US and that return to their home countries after they help their colleagues there publish. So I think that's a really important topic. It highlights a huge benefit of migration that we don't always talk about, which is that flows of knowledge across countries are embedded in people. even if this is something you downplay at the end of your presentation, I think it's an important result that might be in there, and that your original data set is a relevant case study to highlight this benefit. And obviously, if these flows of knowledge lead to more HIV research, it has important implications for health and development. So great stuff. Okay, I mostly have 4 short comments. The first one is whether you have a selection bias in your data. So you mentioned that you only have a fraction of US universities that participate in the program that provided the data. And you also mentioned that you select returnees that are publishing after returning. So I wonder if focusing on these best and brightest maybe overestimates the effect of return migration on publication. And especially if the people that you don't cover in your data are returnees that don't publish. Okay, so maybe would there be a way to increase the data coverage? Another comment is on this graph, which is in your paper, but not in your presentation. It says, why the big drop after the return? So I see that there's a positive effect because the drop is less big for the treated group than for the control group, but it's still surprising if you would expect returnees to start publishing more after returning rather than just relatively more. So I was wondering if this was due to the timing of the training program, whether scientists are selected for publishing well and selected into the US program, but then in the 5 years after going back, their productivity goes down. So if you really want to capture maybe positive effect on publication, it happens later on, or maybe there's another explanation for the drop. And whether you could have some robustness to the control group, try different control groups here. We don't know much about it. We don't know which are the African universities or institutions. We know the countries, but not the specific institutions. Which one are treated, which one are controlled? Are they similar institutions? Another idea is that instead of focusing only on HIV publication, if you could add another field to maybe estimate a diff and diff within institution. So here I just came up with malaria, but I guess there's plenty of others that might be even better. And if you could use, so I saw that you use citations in your last regression to think about flows of knowledge, but maybe we could think about it also more broadly in terms of measuring the quality of the publications. You could use citations, but you could also use the ranking of the journals or the impact factors. The last point is on external validity, I guess, or the framing of the paper. So the way you frame it, of course, is about the benefits of return migration, but I wonder if it's not more an impact evaluation of the US training program. Of course, you don't need to change it, but it's because we don't really know about the control group scientists here, whether they have been migrants or not, right? They haven't participated in that program, but we don't know if they're migrants or not. So I'm sure that you can call these people that train in the US, you can call them return migrants, but can we generalize that result on the specific training program to the effect of return migration in general? Is it possible to go big for more external validities? I don't know if this database is available for all African scientists, if you can scrape their CVs for the PhD institutions and match it to publications. If they have more publications with people in their country where they did their PhD compared to African scientists that did their PhDs at home. I don't know if this would be possible and if it would add external validity, but just an idea. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Pierre-Louis. So, yeah, excuse me. So I have one question, and also Martin Fernandez Sanchez has a question. So please, Martin, go ahead. And then I'll ask my question, and then Caroline, you can reply to mostly to the discussant, but also to the other questions. Martin,
you hear me?
Take the, yeah, I do hear you.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. The tips of the scientists to come back, and whether institutions were providing them with some kind of support, or whether this was the institutional setting, the US training program that provided them incentives to come back, and they change over time.
Okay, my question was, it's probably in the paper, but I was wondering whether the program that you are evaluating is intended for people who come, train, and return, or is intended to scientists, and some of them return, some of them stay, and these are the ones you compare. It was not clear to me what was your control group, essentially. And my second question would be, the way you present is as if return migration would be the only, or the main at least, channel for, innovation and knowledge diffusion. But you could imagine there are other channels. I mean, in your field, in innovation, I mean, there are tons of papers showing that you have these connections also with people staying in the immigration country and building bridges and so on. And so you should probably also compare return migration to other types of connections.
Thank you so much. Okay, that's great. Thank you. And thank you so much for all of these great comments. I'm not going to have time to respond to them all, so I'll just cherry pick a couple. So a few questions about the returnees and maybe selection bias. And this relates to these questions about the program. So yes, the program is designed for people to return. It's a really prestigious program. And so these non-publishing returnees, they're probably not the best and brightest. Anecdotally, everybody actually looks the same. I did some robustness checks on your pre-return characteristics, and everyone looks the same. And from interviewers, I understand that people who disappear from my sample, basically, are those who become the Minister of Health in Kenya. So I'm not too worried about selection on that dimension, but yeah, it might, it's a data limitation. As for this big drop, I consider this the life cycle. But again, also that's the returnee, so productivity once they come back. They're coming back to very prestigious positions. So many of them are coming back to be administrators of the university or Minister of Health. So they're publishing less. So again, this is maybe an issue for external validity, but that's the explanation I have for those features of the data. I like this idea, I've been thinking a lot about the external validity, and so it is an evaluation of a specific program. Now I'm looking at some random returns. I'm scraping just the affiliations to see if somebody's in an institution before, then shows up in an African institution, to see what the kind of effect sizes are there. And I think this is a great point about the diaspora as well. So I can add that in, I think, and see what happens if they stay in the US or something. Yeah, and the incentives to come back, yeah, so the institutions themselves, as far as I understand, aren't providing huge incentives to get these people back, just because they're so resource strapped. Anything that is happening is on the US side. So the NIH recently started providing re-entry grants. So I could exploit that and see if there were any changes around that year that started providing these and get the data. So thank you. That's really, yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Caroline and Pierre-Louis. And we're moving to the third presentation. So Ricardo Turati from the University of Barcelona. And his discussant will be Sulin Sardoshau from Humboldt. So, Ricardo, you know the timing, so but I remind it to you because you're Italian, so it's 18 minutes, 20 max.
Perfect. Thank you all. You can see the slides, I hope. Thank you for the opportunity for organizing this conference. And I'm extremely happy to share with you one of my research about connectedness and the diffusion of cultural traits. And the starting of this project is based mainly on a few facts that we can easily perceive from the data and from reality. First, that indeed the size of the international migrants population globally rise over the recent decades. I mean, it's pretty well known for the people here in the audience that moved from 77 million in the 62 to 272 millions in the last years. And even though the stocks of international migrants are still a small share compared to the world population, it's just a 3.5%. A second fact that we know that nowadays being in contact with these people abroad, with these migrants around the world, is getting easier and easier for the people that stay in the origin country. So natives in the origin country, thanks to the new means of communications and the overall globalization phenomenon, are more can more easily get in touch to the people that are abroad and can know what they are doing, which kind of experience they are living, and sharing what these people are doing and knowing in the destination country. The third fact that I want to mix in this pot is that from the economic literature nowadays more and more, we are more aware by the fact that culture and cultural traits are extremely important, not only to understand the individual preferences and behaviors, but also to understand the different standards of living across societies. So what I want to do is to put all these three facts in one single pot. So the fact that we have more people around the world, the fact that in the end it's easier nowadays to know what they are doing and to share which kind of life they are living, and the fact that culture in the end matters, and combine all these three facts in one research question, that will be the research question of this presentation, which is the following. Does having a reliable connection abroad, which I will define along the paper and the presentation as connectedness, makes natives in the origin country culturally different compared to neighbors in the same region? So that's the fact that the people has this open window to the world, so the fact that they know somebody somewhere, makes them culturally different compared to others that has not this opportunity. And in the paper, but not in this presentation because otherwise it will be too long, I'll try to tackle different sub-questions. So if it's there is a relation between connectedness and cultural traits, in which direction, and which kind of effect has on the global distribution of cultural traits. I try to enter in the potential mechanism, provide suggestive ideas of how connectedness influence the cultural traits. And also, I ask whether this effect, if there is sizable. So should we care about it or not? And how I do this, so what the paper does, the paper uses individual level data at the global level. And this is important because exactly the scope of this paper is really to have a picture of what we have at the global scale. And the paper builds a measure of connectedness and of three cultural traits that we know that are extremely relevant from the economic point of view. Pro-social behavior, religiosity, and gender egalitarian attitudes. Then the paper and the presentation I will show that I investigate the relation between the connectedness and these three cultural traits, comparing individuals within the same region within the country, so as a precise geographical unit. I discuss and try to mitigate as much as I can the endogenous threat of connectedness, and as you can imagine, the threated endogeneity threat are pretty relevant in the context when we talk about culture and cultural aspects. But I will argue that I will mitigate part of this threat. And then in the paper, I explore the mechanism and the effect on the relation with the global distribution of cultural traits. The results, in a nutshell, are the following. First, I will show you that the connected individuals are indeed culturally different. So having a connection abroad, or being connectedness is associated with a distinctive set of cultural traits. Individuals have a higher level of pro-social behavior, they are more religious, and they share higher gender egalitarian attitudes. Moreover, I will show you that connectedness will bring cultural convergence across regions, so makes cultural through a catch-up effect. So regions with a lower level of traits will catch up the regions with a higher level of those traits, and also will foster cultural diversity within the regions. Finally, the paper explores the mechanism, and I will not have the time to show you today probably in the presentation, but we can discuss about it later on. I provide suggestive evidence that the effects are stronger among less educated natives, suggesting that indeed this open window to the world is indeed an access to novel information that is happening also through an economic channel, so helping economically the people left behind. And also, I find differential effect based on the location of connection, suggesting a sort of transfer of norms from the destination countries to the origin ones. So to enter more deeply in the paper, I can explain the data, and luckily you already saw the data today in the presentation of Michael Clemens. I use the Gallup World Poll, that is individual level surveys. I have the data from 2009, 2012, and my sample cover a lot of countries, 148 countries, and around 700,000 of natives. And among the several information available in the Gallup World Poll, it's important that we have also intra-country regional identifier. So we have information on the location of those people within each country. And in the paper, I harmonize this data with the GADMA, the Global Administrative Data, to have some harmonized measure of regions within the country. Then I provide you how I measure connectedness, and I measure it using this item available in the Gallup World Poll, which is the answer to the following question. Do you have relatives or friends who are living in another country whom you can count on to help you when you need them or not? If an individual answered positively to this question, I code it as a connected native, so there's a reliable connection abroad. And we know from the literature that this measure is a measure of strong connection. A paper of Bertolina Voisin showed that people that is connected have a higher probability or a higher willingness to move abroad, and also they desire to move to the country where this connection is. Because among the information that we have about this connection, the only information that we have actually is the location in which country this connection is living. And on average, in my sample, I've that 30% of the population has a connection abroad, and around 70% of the connection resides in OECD high-income countries. To give you an idea of the scope of the analysis and also about the heterogeneity of connectedness around the world, here I plot the percentage of connected individuals within each region. First, you can have an idea again about the dimension of the analysis and that I will show you, and also that in the end the connectedness, so the fact that people has connection abroad is really heterogeneous across countries. You can see that a lot of high connectedness is present in regions here in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, while part of the world like China and India, we have a lower level of connectedness. But we have a lot of heterogeneity also within countries. Look at, for instance, the US, you can see that even between states of the US, there is some degree of heterogeneity. Then we can move to the measures of cultural traits. And as I told you, I focus on 3 relevant cultural traits that in the paper I show that are positively related with a series of economic outcomes. And also I match them with the economic preferences measured by the Global Preferences Survey. And they show that in the end are related also to economic preferences like risk behavior and so on. And the 3 cultural traits are the following. The first one is a measure of pro-social behavior, which capture as a proxy of individuals' altruistic behaviors that in the end are positive related with cooperation and civic engagement. And this is standardizing with mean 0 and standard deviation equal to 1. Religiosity, which is in the end the answer to the question, is religion an important part of your daily life? And we know from the literature that religiosity is negatively related with the economic growth and the openness to innovation of individuals. Nonetheless, people that, on average, religious people have a higher level of subjective well-being. Given those facts, we know in any case the religiosity matters and is coded as a dummy variable. And the last cultural traits in the analysis is the gender egalitarian views. It's again an index with mean 0 and standard deviation equal to 1, and it proxy individuals' attitudes towards gender equality. So the fact that women should have the same legal rights compared to men. And we know again from the literature that the gender egalitarian attitudes could transform to gender discriminatory behaviors, which can have an effect on the women empowerment and in the end in the overall growth of a given country. Those are the three cultural traits in the analysis. And here I'll present you the first and simple specification which I test my hypothesis, and the dependent variable is the three cultural traits. The main variable of interest is the dummy, whether an individual is connected or not. And then I introduce also an interaction term with the average cultural trait of the country where the connection resides, so where the connection lives, to capture whether there is some differential effects based on the location of the connection. Then I include a set of individual controls, and then a regional fixed effect to capture for local aspects like local time invariant factors like institutions, traditions, local culture, and then a country by year fixed effect to capture for time invariant variables at the country level like GDP and unemployment rate. And the first set of results is the following. You can see in this table that in the end, connectedness is positively related with all the pre-cultural traits. So in the end, people that have a reliable connection abroad are associated with a higher level of social behavior, higher religiosity, and higher gender egalitarian attitudes. Moreover, when we include in the specification also the interaction term with the culture, the destination country of the where the connection resides, we can see that it matters only for social behavior, while has no significant effect for the other two traits. And this, from this table, the first result that we should extract that in the end, connected individuals, so connectedness is associated to a distinctive set of cultural traits. And in the paper, I provide a several set of robustness about these kind of results, trying to different types of ties, so whether they have family ties or weak ties abroad, changing the structure of the controls or the structure of fixed effects, dropping the regions, dropping regions with small observations, but in the end, all the robustness checks point always in the same direction. Then we enter to something more demanding, which is dealing with the potential endogenous threat in this story, which is in the end a selection bias. Which kind of figure I have in mind. So far I'm showing you that being connected is associated with the positive cultural traits, higher level of cultural traits. However, for instance, if religious people has a higher probability to have a connection abroad, what I'm showing you is just a simple correlation, and any causal claim could be made. However, since culture is an extremely endogenous phenomenon, it's pretty difficult to find a proper way to identify it. And I have to be honest, in my paper, I have no silver bullet of identification, so no randomized control trials, perfect IV, or diff in diff. But what I do is, since culture is extremely endogenous, then I can run a set of empirical tests to control for other factors that are related in the end with other individual characteristics that are related in the end with cultural traits, and showing that with this battery of alternative tests, the results hold. And so what I do is first to control for a broad measure of connectedness, so control for connectedness also locally, not only abroad, with the idea that in the end, if people are culturally selected abroad, they are also culturally selected locally. Then I test whether selection of non-observables matters, so whether I'm missing something, and also I deal with potential selection on observables by performing several matching methods. And the results are the following. When I control for general connectedness, so I control whether people has not connection only abroad, but also locally, so adding an additional control, the results hold. So in the end, having a reliable connection abroad, so having this open window to the world, is always positively associated with the three cultural traits in analysis. Second, when I test the selection on unobservables using the Austrian methodology, my estimates always pass the test. So in the end, when I estimate the degree of selection on unobservables, the delta is always above 1, which undermines any concerns to potential big threat related to unobservables. And finally, I deal with selection on observables by performing several matching methods. I do both propensity score matching and covariance matching. And in the end, with all these methods, doing different kind of propensity score, changing the kernels, computing the Rosenbaum bounds, really doing whatever is available in this kind of world, the results hold always in the same direction. And here I will show you the propensity score matching results. And as you can see, having a reliable connection abroad is always associated with a higher level of social behavior, religiosity, and gender egalitarian attitudes. It's important to stress that when I do the matching, I do it within the same region. And here I'm plotting the 1% confidence interval. Then we can move to the last part of this presentation of today, which in the end, what I've shown you so far, that having this open window to the world is associated with a distinctive set of cultural traits. Then in the paper, I try to understand what are the implications and what are the potential mechanisms. And in presentation of the today, I will not enter in the mechanism so far, but I will discuss more about whether connectedness is affecting the cultural homogenization or diversification around the world. In particular, I will show you whether connectedness is bringing cultural convergence and divergence across regions, so whether regions could become more culturally similar or more culturally diverse across, and also within regions, so whether connectedness is fostering diversity within regions or homogeneity. And then we can start with the first one, so convergence and divergence across regions. And here I'm kind of borrowing one of the questions that are taken in the paper of Hillel, Slim, and Arthur. So whether in the end connectedness brings convergence and divergence across regions, and given the positive relation between connectedness and the cultural traits, it's pretty easy to see that whether if I estimate an effect that is stronger in a region characterized by a lower level of trait, then what does it mean? That we have a convergence dynamic pushing towards a catch-up effect. So regions with a lower level of trait will reach the regions with a higher level of trait. And we should have the opposite story if the effect is stronger in regions characterized already by a high level of trait. To test for these potential stories, what I've done, I split the sample of regions by tercile of each cultural trait, and then I perform my estimates to see whether I find any differential effects in the estimates. And here you can see the results. First, for social behavior, and as you can see from here, there are no strong differential effects in the end. I find always a strong positive and statistically significant effect associated to connectedness and social behavior. However, when I move to religiosity and gender egalitarian attitudes, so from column 4 to column 9 in the table, you can see that the estimates are precisely done or precisely evaluated only among the first or second tercile for religiosity and only on the first tercile for gender egalitarian attitude, suggesting that in the end, if any, there should be a sort of convergence story from a catch-up effect from regions with a lower level of these cultural traits towards a region with a higher level of these cultural traits. Then the last thing that I will show you for today is whether connectedness is associated with a higher level of diversity or homogeneity within the regions. And here I borrow the methodology proposed by Desbet and Waxiarg, and what I do is computing first an index of cultural fractionalization within the regions, which in the end measure what? Measure the probability to pick up randomly two individuals from the region, and they hold two different values of the cultural trait in the analysis. And then what I do, I compute the average level of cultural fractionalization over the subsample of regions based on the diffusion of connectedness. So cultural diversity in regions characterized by a lower level of connectedness and cultural diversity computed in regions characterized by a high level of connectedness, so where a lot of people have a reliable connection abroad. And here you can see the results for social behavior, religiosity, and gender egalitarian attitudes. And it's pretty clear to see that there is an increasing pattern. So when we move from a region with a lower level of connectedness towards regions with a lot of people that has a reliable connection abroad, we can see an increase in diversity in the three cultural traits. So having more people with a reliable connection abroad will foster diversity within the regions. And then what I do, okay, I find this increasing diversity with the diffusion of connectedness. The last thing that I do is try to decompose this diversity and to see which kind of individual characteristics matters more in order to explain such diversity within. And here, for the last...
You have 1 more minute, Riccardo.
Last slide, perfect. Here I show the decomposition, so which kind of individual characteristics matters more in order to explain this diversity. And here I compete connectedness with education and employment status that we know are extremely important for this kind of context. And in the free case, connectedness is able to explain more this diversity within the regions compared to others' individual characteristics. So to sum up, it's over. I show you that connected natives are associated with a distinctive set of cultural traits. They are more active in the society, religious and shared and egalitarian attitudes. And if any, connectedness should bring a cultural convergence across regions and foster cultural diversity within regions. Then in the paper, I discuss about the mechanism and also the magnitude, so whether the effect is sizable or not, but I will spare the time for a proper discussion, and I thank you for your attention.
So thank you. So Sulin, it's your turn.
Yes, wonderful. As you can see, I'm calling from the northern part of Europe. So it's starting to get dark here.
Yeah. Do you have candles or?
No, it's a light actually. All right, let me start with my presentation. Okay, Ricardo, this is extremely impressive work, and more impressive even that you managed to summarize 100 pages of your paper in 20 minutes. I think that's a record. So you show a lot of things in that paper. You show that connections abroad increase pro-social behavior, religiosity, gender egalitarian views. You show that connections increase the cultural convergence across regions, the cultural heterogeneity within regions. You look at how connections differentially affect individual culture along different lines, how they increase economic wealth through remittances and how that could be a potential channel. And then you simulate in the end what it means to have connections abroad and how that changes the global cultural architecture. So very impressive work, many interesting results, and I think I would love to jump into any of those deeper, but I'll keep it short. So what I'm gonna move aside is the selection part, because I think you've done a great effort to counter this in a setting where you don't have any experimental setup to claim causality. You're doing a lot to do that. So let me focus first on the choice of your outcomes. So intuitively, I understand, religiosity seems to be an important value, gender egalitarian views and pro-social behavior, but how do we get there? So even in the Falk paper, there are references to risk-taking behavior, to other types of attitudes, hard work versus luck. So is there a way to say, or to come to a selection of questions in this whole battery of questions that are asked in the Gallup World Poll, to say, okay, though this is, let's say, the subset of questions that explain the largest share of the cross-regional variation, for instance, and take that subset of questions. So what I was missing a little bit was more of a data-driven approach to the selection of variables. It seemed to me more like a selection of variables and then sort of ex post saying, okay, this is where we see the importance. So would be nice to see maybe a broadening or maybe even an index of a full set of questions. The second thing that I wanted to bring up was the measure of connectedness. So the question in the Gallup World Poll carries a lot of other dimensions. It asks, do you have relatives or friends who are living in another country whom you can count on to help you when you need them? So it's covering the definition of friends, of counting on, and of help if you need them, and the ability, sorry, to maintain these relationships. And these are all functions of the outcomes that you're looking at, right? So whether this pro-social behavior, religiosity, and gender egalitarian views may somehow be connected to the ability to have these contacts. And that's not just a question of selection that you address in your paper, but also about what kind of relationships do you have, and are they important to you or not? So maybe it would be nice to see how your measure of connectedness maps on to real migration networks. Maybe you can show some evidence of regional emigration data and the connectedness measure that you have for the Gallup World Poll. So just to get some feeling about whether you have any sort of selection there, just in the mentioning of this question. So along this question, do you have a measure? So you say that friendship ties are weak ties and family ties are more important ties. I'm not so sure about that. But what I would maybe like to see is whether the proposed mechanism would basically exist for ties where there's actually exchange, right? Your window to the world. So we would expect that you only see this type of convergence or change in attitudes if there's exchange between the migrants and the home community. So do you have a measure that shows us the intensity of contact, or have a measure that just maps the existence of these contexts rather than the quality of the connection? And last point is on the mechanisms. So you have so many interesting results, and it would be worthwhile to jump in any of those. I just have a hard time wrapping my head around what is the big sort of narrative, the structured idea along which you are testing all of these things. Do you have a model of cultural remittances in mind? So do you think this window into the world basically says, I am converging to the values of the destination country of my connection? This is basically what you do implicitly by interacting the connections variable with the average culture at destination. But it would be good to see, okay, those are my hypotheses, or maybe even a model or something that tells me I expect these mechanisms to hold, I expect this to come out, and I'm trying to test that using different subsamples, and basically many of the tests you already have. I think it just needs to come together and sort of and have an overarching framework for me to really grasp what's going on. So what happens, for instance, if you have several connections with competing or compounding effects? Does the heterogeneity come from the individuals with and without connections that you find, or is it regions having different destination countries with different values and people therefore converging, right? So this is also Hillel's paper, right? With depending on whether you go to Russia or to Western Europe on sort of the political beliefs of the people that stay behind. So what is happening there? So in general, amazing work, a lot of interesting things. Maybe there's a way to structure all of this to bring it into streamline it into a narrative, and then I think it's really great work. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Suline. I will just add maybe one comment. I think it's well taken that it would be good to have some theoretical expectations about what you expect and whether the different results you get can be interpreted within that framework, whether they are consistent one with the other or not. I wanted to ask you about your very last sentence in your conclusion slides. You say, if I recall, that you find sizable effects for social behavior, but non-sizable effects for gender equality and religiosity. However, you find heterogeneous effects for the last two and not for the first one. So how do you reconcile this with your convergence result? Because you said I expect convergence when I have an effect on the highest or the lowest tercile, but then you find for these non-sizable effects, while for the first outcome, you do find sizable effects, but presumably no convergence because no heterogeneity. Thank you. So you have 0 minutes to answer, so we'll give you 1.
Okay, I will just answer to this comment because in the end is related also to the choice of the outcomes. Yes, indeed, my feeling about, and also from what I understood from the work of Desmet and Waxiarg and on this kind of topic, that in the end, exactly, each cultural trait has its own story. So from the selection of the outcome variables and also for the dynamics that I try to simulate at the end, in the end, really what I'm perceiving in the end, exactly, it's rough to have a data-driven method, but I will try because indeed it's a fantastic idea. But in the end, more and more some cultural traits are more persistent. So the effect that I find also, for instance, for religiosity is small and will take more time to change, while other traits, in this case, in my case, pro-social behavior, are more prone to be changed through time or be changed by this open window to the world that I'm describing. So I really believe exactly also in terms of the selection, but if I found a better way to explain why I'm picking up these traits, is in the end exactly I didn't want to put too many cultural traits in the pot because in the end each cultural trait has its own story, and the story will be never ending.
Okay, thank you. And if I guess Surin will be happy to exchange with you bilaterally on the other points she raised. So we're moving to the last presentation. Martin Fernandez Sanchez and your discussant is Michael Clements. You have the very hard task to keep people behind their screen and listening to you, because people in Northern America want to go for lunch and people in Europe want to go for dinner. So we'll see how you manage to do that. Please, Martin.
Yeah, thank you much for everybody who has made this possible. I'm really happy to be part of this amazing program. And thanks to all of you who are staying until the very end. This paper deals with one of the most popular, controversial, and really old questions in the literature of migration economics, and is what is the impact of immigration on human capital at the places of origin? So there is this hot debate, brain drain, brain gain, that has been going on since the 90s, since the 1970s. And there's been a vast literature dealing with all these issues, but most of it has adopted a short-term view, a short-run view, looking at self-selection or the impact of remittances on the family left behind, or the opportunities to migrate may affect children's investments in education. So what I'm doing here is more of revisiting this whole question from a historic long-term perspective with more than 100-year time horizon. And you may wonder why it's so important to look at the long run and precisely when we are talking about human capital. Well, there are multiple. One of them is that the impact of migration may well evolve over time. So what we find in the short run change in 5, 10 years. At the same time, if we want to take into account all the mechanisms involved in the nexus between immigration and human capital, we have to consider future generations. And having a long-term perspective also allows me to explore other mechanisms that have been previously overlooked. So the context of my study will be the age of mass migration, a period that saw massive migration flows from Europe to the American continent. It's estimated that between 1850 and 1930, over 40 million Europeans emigrated, and I'll be focusing in particular on the Galician mass migration to Latin America that took place mostly between 1920 and 1930. So what is the goal of this paper? Well, is to examine the impact of mass emigration on human capital accumulation at origin through the whole century. So to carry out this project, I had to collect and digitize history from many different sources and combine all this with modern census and survey data. I also rely on a new proxy for immigration that I will explain later on. And in terms of the empirical approach, I rely on two instruments to sort of infer the stock of immigrants as a whole and in different points in time. So to sort of predict the intensity, I will rely on a proxy of pioneer immigration measured long time before, and then I will have pull factor. So continue, where on earth is Galicia, right? What is the context we are talking about? So Galicia is a region in the northwest of Spain, and you may wonder, well, why should we care about such a tiny part of the world? Well, it turns out the Galician diaspora was huge, both in absolute and in relative terms. So between 18 and 1930, more than 1.5 million people emigrated to Latin America. And if we look at gross emigration rates, they were way higher than any other European country at the time. So we are talking about a huge migration. Actually, in 3 decades, between 1900 and 1930, the equivalent to 60% of the population have emigrated. Now, why so people left Galicia? Well, it was a very poor place. There was also a tradition of internal and seasonal migration to Portugal and other parts of Spain. So this motivated this migration flow. We know from different historical data that most of migrants were men. They were very young. They were mostly farmers, all of them, also the economy of Galicia at the time, and they were highly literate, much higher than the average of the population at the time. There was this phenomenon of migration change. You know, migrants already established in Latin America would invite others to join. There was this kind of circular migration, you know. Migration was a family strategy to raise extra and with the objective of return home after a couple of years. So, very importantly, these Galician migrants located in some of the largest and the most vibrant cities in Latin America at the time, and even if they were farmers to begin with, they worked in services, in areas in which there were high returns to being literate compared to what was the case in Galicia. So, very quickly, we could see the Galician emigration in 3 phases. Very incipient migration between the 1830s and 1860s because of some agrarian crisis and rainfall shocks. Then at the end of the century, immigration starts to increase, and there are some networks that start to be created. And it's in the decades of the 20th century when we have an explosion of departures due to the rapid growth in Latin America and the combination of migrant networks and the reduction of transportation costs. So what is the data that I'll be using? We don't have, unfortunately, from official statistics, very good data at the disaggregated level, only at the provincial level. But to deal with this limitation, I will be relying on a measure of the population censuses, which is the missing residents. And these are people who happen to be absent from their household, from their municipality where they permanently live the day of the census, which was the 31st of December. So this will capture a measure of migration because everybody would have been declared to be missing regardless of the reason why they are missing or the reason or duration of that stay abroad. So you need to bear in mind that this proxy, this share of missing men will be for the stock of migrants, but particularly young men living alone. And in the paper, I do a number of validation exercises comparing the data of missing residents, missing men, and also sea departures in Galicia over time for different provinces in Spain and even in Italy. So this is how the original data look like. This is the original population censuses. So I have to transcribe manually all the data of all these Galician municipalities from all the population. So this gives me this measure of missing individuals and also the number of literate individuals in each municipality. So I've done this for all the available censuses, historical censuses. And then I have many other additional data sources, most of them new. So I collected information about Galician migrants associations that I will come back to this later on. I also know the destination of migrants at the municipality level, and this will be central for my identification strategy. I also collected new historical data before the mass migration that I exploit to some balance checks and to provide support to my empirical strategy. And finally, contemporary data coming both from the population censuses and different surveys that will provide me with measures of human capital and also very subtle measures of beliefs and values about education. So how do I do this? Well, the paper, the analysis is split in two parts. One is more of a historical analysis while immigration was taking place. So I have a decadal panel of all Galician municipalities between 1900 and 1930, and I'll be estimating the impact of the share of missing men on literacy rates. Now, for the long run, given that I will have a repeated cross-section, right? So I will have different measures of attainment and the average share of missing men observed between 1900 and 1930. As you may already be thinking, trying to run these regressions by simply OLS could be prone to several challenges, to threats, such as measurement error in the historical data, confounders, and even reverse causation. So to deal with all these issues, I implement an instrumental variables strategy that exploits two particular features of this migration experience. So to get an idea of the intensity of immigration, I will be exploiting a proxy of pioneer immigration that was taking place in the very early period, right? And for this, I will rely on the sex imbalance, the adult sex ratio in 1860. Then, to predict the timing of immigration, right, when people will leave every single municipality in Galicia, in my panel, I will use a pull factor. So I will be combining the destination of the migrants from those places and the economic growth in those particular countries in Latin America to sort of construct average measure of the GDP per capita growth in that migrant destination from that place. So I have this deep information on the destinations, the three main destinations of Galician migrants that I use to weight the different trajectories of economic growth in those Latin American economies. All right, so let's now see the results of this historical period. What I find is that in the very short run, the immediate impact of immigration is to depress literacy rates at origin. So we see an effect of around 50% of a standard deviation as a response to one standard deviation increase in the share of missing men. However, this effect is just temporary, it's just transient. And 1 decade later, the impact of immigration becomes strong and positive and persists afterwards. If we look at the differences by gender, we find that this short-run negative effect for both men and women, but however, the net gains in literacy rates experienced 1 decade later only take place for men. So women recover their baseline literacy rate, so they are back in track, but they're paying for them. What are the mechanisms then that could explain these results, and in particular this differential effect of men and women? Well, remember again that migrants were positively selected. So from the aggregated statistics that we have, it's inferred that the literacy rates among Galician migrants are as high as 80% compared to an average literacy rate in the population in 1920 of 50%. So doing some kind of back of the envelope calculation with the intensity of migration and this degree of selection actually matches pretty well the estimates that I have in the panel analysis. So only because of this positive selection, we could explain this negative effect. Now, for the medium run, we have to know that there was a high rate of return migration according to official statistics. As much as 65% of Galician migrants eventually came back. And there is also some anecdotal and suggestive descriptive evidence that there was higher investments in children's education in places that experienced more immigration. Now, why women didn't benefit as much? Probably because the rates of return among women are lower than men. Now, what happened in the long run then? So now I'll be using these missing men at the beginning of the century and look at different measures of educational attainment later on using the contemporary censuses. So what I find is that there was a persistent positive effect of immigration on human capital at origin. And here I have the of individuals who attain different levels of education. And you can see that across the board, for individuals born in the 1930s up to the 1970s, there were gains in education. And there were gains in different levels of education depending on the period in which. If we want to see the same measure of education, such as the share of people who completed secondary education in those years, we see again this pattern in which there is a positive effect. But in 1981, for instance, there is no gain for women. So it seems that the benefits for women are sort of like staggering. They are coming behind those. But by 2011, there is a strong, precisely positive estimate of the effect of historical immigration on educational attainment at origin. So we could discuss many different channels that could explain these long-run positive effects, the persistence of human capital. We could think that immigration may have made these buildings wealthier and that this income effect actually incentivized people to invest in education, but it's not the case. Actually, places that experience more immigration are today poorer on average. We could think of the transmission of education across generations, from parents to children, right? That the initial shock that we observed in the historical period was enough to sustain higher human capital 50, 70, 80 years later. But this is very difficult to test empirically. I will be now addressing two novel mechanisms that haven't been explored yet on why migrants can have a positive impact in the long run on their communities of origin. And that will be the impact of collective remittances, those targeting public goods, and also social remittances that are related to the value of education or the returns of education. So let me tell you the story of this picture. So this is a school that was constructed in my hometown in 1918 by a migrants association, right? So this is the school where my parents' generation, my grandparents' and parents' generation actually. So this is not an anecdote. This was something very common at the time. So it turns out that Galician migrants formed hundreds of associations in Latin America with fellow neighbors from their home communities. And most of these associations have as an objective to invest in their educational aspects in their hometowns in Galicia. So they conduct hundreds of schools to which I collected data about them. We also have anecdotal evidence on instances by migrants and returnees regarding education, such as monitoring that children who were left behind actually attended the school, also urging public authorities to enforce attendance to schools. I think that all these remittances, collective remittances to construct the schools, these social remittances about the importance of education, and also the role of return migrants as models for younger generations could have actually had an impact on these children later on. So to abord this question, as I mentioned, I gathered information around 400 Galician migrants associations with data on which is the municipality to which they are linked to, and whether they constructed a school or not, and when that happened. And I combined this with data from the 1981 population censuses, in which I have education by birth cohorts and birth municipality. And sort of doing a cohort analysis, right? So assigning individuals the number of associations or schools that have been created open before they were 10, I this potential effect of the associations and the migrant schools on educational attainment. And what I find is that maybe, I don't know if surprisingly or not, but these migrants associations seems to have fostered more immigration, but this sort of effect is compensated by the schools they constructed. And actually, in particular, these schools were effective in children's educational attainment at the time. I also explored the question of whether migrants could have fostered a change in norms and beliefs about the value of education. And to examine this, survey data, recent survey data, in which there is a very nice question in which individuals are asked how important is education and effort to succeed in life. And people have to rank their beliefs in a scale from 0 to 10. So using the same IB strategy as in the learning analysis, so regressing this measure of values on the average instrumented by pioneer immigration, I find suggestive evidence pointing to a positive impact of these values for education. So places that were more exposed to immigration today display higher levels of value of education or value of effort. And this effect actually remains very similar even after controlling for individuals' own educational attainment. So these are changes in norms and beliefs that go beyond the experience changes in education of these individuals. So let me conclude by discussing what I think are some of the key insights of my research. So I've shown you that despite a short-run negative effect, a short-run loss in human capital, the mass immigration led to actually an increase in human capital that has persisted for 100 years. So this highlights the importance of having long-term horizons when analyzing the impacts of migration, because they may evolve in very complex ways. So it's also very important to analyze cycles, because as I showed you, it's not the same whether one focuses on primary or secondary or tertiary completion rates. And to conclude, I'm showing you that migrants can actually have an influence through many other channels beyond monetary remittances to their families, which is one of the topics that has been studied the most. So collective remittances, sending monetary remittances as a group may benefit the whole community if they are well targeted, if they are in the needs of that population, such as school, hospitals, and so on. And social remittances and the role of return migrants as drivers of cultural change can also have a strong impact on economic development and human capital, as in this case. So to conclude, I think that the bottom line is that to experience these gains from human capital, I think that the essence is to the links between migrants and their communities of origin. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Martin. And so we started the day with Michael, who was the first speaker of the first session, and we will end the day with Michael, the last speaker of this second session. So Michael, please, we can't wait hearing your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now, yes. We can now see you and hear you.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you all for staying this late. It's just a real pleasure to discuss this nice paper. It's an important paper. The claimed contribution, the contract that Martin signs with readers upon beginning, is that this is the first credibly causally identified quantitative study of the very long-term human capital consequences of mass emigration from a poor region. I think that claim is solid, and I really think that any future work on that question, the human capital consequences in the long term of large-scale immigration from poor regions, will need to cite this work. It's a bold paper. Why? Because currently, in empirical economics, there are several revolutions underway. Two of those revolutions involve shift share instruments and studies using long-term persistence of geographic patterns. And into that melee boldly strides Martin, using shift share instruments and relying on long-term persistence of geographic patterns. He comes out quite well. One thing that particularly impressed me about the paper is how it deals with persistence. He addresses the critiques of Morgan Kelly compellingly and recently, and also others, claiming that spatial correlation could be severely biasing the coefficient estimates and standard errors in many influential studies of long-term persistence of geographic patterns. Martin takes the quite extraordinary step of generating 1,000 placebo Galicias in map grids with spatial correlation, showing that that spatial correlation per se is very likely to spuriously generate his results, and that was very convincing. In the shift chair design, Martin takes very seriously the concerns of Goldsmith-Pinkham et al. And Jaeger et al. About the exogeneity of the initial shares. Something I didn't see in the paper, or maybe I missed it, is dealing with the critique of Adam et al. Last year in the QJE, pointing out that in these designs, the residuals might exhibit correlation according to the initial shares, even across regions that might not be spatially contiguous, and that the standard errors need to be adjusted for that. And if they were, I didn't notice it. On mechanisms, I wanted a little bit more. I thought you could really do a lot more and develop the potential of the paper. In the short run, we have this negative effect on human capital. And I found myself wondering just how much of that is the mechanical disappearance of literate people, and how much of it was the changing returns to human capital investment, along the lines of what Hillel and David Mackenzie influentially wrote about in the Journal of Population Economics for Mexico. It seems like it would be quite easy to do, in that you can track cohorts of people through the census and measure the mechanical disappearance of human capital, compare it to effects that you would expect from changing returns to human capital. If indeed the emigration was skill focused, it could be that those actually go against each other, and that would be something quite interesting to explore. In the long run, I think there's an opportunity to link this work to other literatures. So when I saw you talking about the long-term effects of school construction, I saw an opportunity to link to other literature on exactly that issue. Aronson and Mazumder in the JPE comes to mind, studying the very long-term human capital effects of the pure construction of school buildings by a northern philanthropist for Black kids in the U.S. South early in the 20th century. How do the coefficient estimates compare? How do the mechanisms compare? And then, of course, as you discussed explicitly just now, there are important long-term mechanisms that you don't delve into. There was an ellipsis in that slide, and appropriately so. There's Curry and Moretti in the QJE talking about intergenerational transmission through the physical health of people. There's the most obvious one, which you also mentioned, which is the pure alleviation of capital constraints to investment in education, which is really a separate mechanism. Even if a school is accessible and I have the norms and values that it's important to attend school, I might not simply be better able to make that investment if my father or mother earns more money, having gotten more educated themselves. And I think you could do a very interesting decomposition exercise using modern data of the relative importance of these things. I say all of this just to, as part of a broader comment that I really think there's an opportunity to take this paper beyond being an excellent migration and development paper to being more about the long-term determinants of human capital formation, and that not instead of its current contribution, but in addition to its current contribution, and that could expand the potential for general interest readership. Last thing I want to raise, and people who know my work will not be surprised that I raise this. Whenever we're regressing shares, share variables on share variables, we need to worry about a bias described by Richard Cronmall in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society, 1993. It works like this. The core regression in this paper is something very close to regressing literates as a fraction of the population on missing as a fraction of the population, and other stuff. Now, not exactly because it's missing men as a fraction of men, but really that it's a population, and men, of course, are very highly correlated with each other. So it's quite analogous to this, and you can see immediately that a positive coefficient estimate on phi could arise simply because population is in both of these variables. Just to convince you that this is real, here's 5 lines of Stata code. Unfortunately, as a side effect revealing that I am not young enough or cool enough to use open access statistical software. But if you generate a placebo population variable, generate a placebo missing variable, divide it by placebo population, generate a placebo literate variable, divide that by placebo population, and just regress one on the other, you will get a huge highly statistically significant coefficient. And what Cronmal shows is that it's not enough to control linearly for population, as Martin's regressions do. You have to control non-linearly for population, in this case 1 over population, in order to eliminate the bias. And there's a fine point here, which is that the regressions also contain fixed effects, so you'd be concerned about bias in population rather than levels of population. But I think it still could arise, and it's something that you might not hear from other people, but that might come up in the refereeing process. All in all, just really nice work, and I'm certain to be referring to it myself many times in the future.
Thank you, Michael. I think it was a very nice, short and important discussion. I leave it to Martin to answer if he wants for 1-2 minutes, and then we will wrap up and reconvene tomorrow.
Yeah, I'll be very short. I just want to thank Michael for his suggestions and all types of dimensions of the paper, from the framing and even like titles, such as the analysis you were showing. So I'm really thankful, and yeah, I'm looking forward to improve the paper. So I don't think we have to keep people any longer here.
Okay, so I will close the session. Thank you all. Michael is not as present in the program tomorrow, but there are still many interesting papers and discussions. So I invite you to join us tomorrow as well.